3,000 people walked into government offices, signed their names on official documents, and then ceased to exist. No graves, no records, no obituaries. The government didn't kill them. It did something far stranger. It simply deleted them. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly which government ran this program, why they did it, who the 3,000 people were, and why the officials responsible never spent a single day in prison. This story has been buried for decades. You were never supposed to find it. To understand what happened, you need to go back to the years just after World War II. The world was rebuilding, borders were being redrawn, governments were drunk on wartime bureaucratic power, and some of them decided they weren't ready to give it up. In the late 1940s, a classified internal program quietly launched inside the United States federal government. It had no public name, no congressional oversight, no budget line that any ordinary citizen could find. What it had was a mandate to make certain people administratively disappear. These weren't criminals. They weren't spies. Not all of them anyway. They were defectors, whistleblowers, foreign scientists the government wanted to protect or control, witnesses to things that hadn't happened yet on paper. The program worked by doing something deceptively simple. It didn't erase the people. It erased the documentation that proved they existed. Birth certificates were pulled from county records. Social security numbers were voided and reassigned. Draft cards, census entries, employment records. All of it quietly removed, altered, or destroyed. If you looked for these people in the official record, you found nothing. A clean white wall where a human life used to be. And here's the part that should disturb you most. It was entirely legal. The same wartime emergency statutes that gave the government power to seize factories, censor newspapers, and relocate entire ethnic communities. Those same laws had never been fully repealed. They were just sitting there, quietly, like loaded weapons in an unlocked drawer. So who were these people? The answer is more unsettling than you might expect, because they weren't one kind of person. They were several. The first group were the scientists. You've heard of Operation Paperclip, the program that brought Nazi scientists to America after the war. What you haven't been told is that Paperclip had a shadow component. For every scientist who received a public reassignment, there were others who couldn't be publicly acknowledged at all. Their research was too controversial, their wartime records too damning, so they were given new identities and absorbed into classified projects with no paper trail connecting them to who they'd been. The second group were defectors from the Soviet Union. The Cold War was turning cold fast, and the CIA was desperate for intelligence. When a Soviet official crossed over, the agency couldn't just hand them a green card and a house in the suburbs. That would be an international incident. Instead, these individuals were processed through the administrative erasure program. Old identity, gone. New identity, constructed whole cloth. To the Soviet government, the defector had simply vanished. The third group is the one that keeps historians up at night. Civilians, American citizens. Not all of them volunteered. Some were witnesses to classified military accidents, nuclear tests that went wrong, biological experiments that exceeded their parameters. These people were approached by government officials, told that for reasons of national security, their continued public existence was a problem. Some were compensated, some were simply coerced. A few disappeared without any record of consent at all. 3,000 people across these categories, and that's only the number researchers have been able to reconstruct. The actual figure could be higher, much higher. The mechanics of erasing a person from official history are more intricate than you'd imagine, and the fact that this program functioned as smoothly as it did tells you something chilling about how much infrastructure for control already existed inside the American administrative state. Here's how it worked, step by step. First, identification. A subject was flagged by one of several agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission. A file was opened, not in the subject's name, under a case number. Second, documentation retrieval. Field agents, many of them operating under the cover of routine federal audits, physically visited county clerk offices, hospital records departments, university registrars. They didn't ask for records. They requisitioned them under emergency statutes. Librarians and clerks were told the materials were needed for national security review. Most never asked a second question. Third, replacement. A new identity was constructed using real deceased individuals, people who had died young, whose sparse records made plausible cover stories. The program essentially wore the skin of the dead to hide the living. And fourth, relocation. The subject was moved, sometimes across the country, sometimes across the world, given a name, a backstory, a set of documents that would pass any check, because the government had written them. But here's what they didn't tell you. Several of the case officers who ran this program kept private journals. They knew what they were doing was extraordinary. Some of them believed it was justified, others were not so sure. Those journals survived, and decades later, when a FOIA request finally shook a small portion of them loose from a sealed archive in Maryland, the implications were staggering. Those journals named names, specific operations, specific people, and one entry, dated 1953, referenced something the researchers who found it couldn't immediately explain. A sub-program, a program within the program, something the case officers called the residuals. But before we get to what the residuals were, you need to understand something even stranger about this story. Because the erasure program didn't just affect the people it targeted, it left marks on everyone around them, families, neighbors, and in at least a dozen documented cases, it left marks on the historical record in ways that are still creating confusion today. The residuals were a problem the program created for itself. When you erase a person from the official record, you don't erase them from the memories of everyone who knew them. You don't erase the neighbor who watched them leave, the coworker who got a postcard, the sibling who kept writing letters to an address that no longer existed in any directory. These people, the ones left behind, started asking questions. And in a surveillance state, running classified erasure operations, people asking questions are a liability. The residuals program was the solution. It was, in essence, a secondary operation designed to manage the loose ends. In mild cases, this meant disinformation, planted stories about subjects who had moved abroad or died in accidents. In more serious cases, the people asking questions found themselves subjects of FBI surveillance files, quietly flagged as potential security risks. Their own lives made just uncomfortable enough that most of them stopped pushing. And in the most extreme documented cases, the 1953 journal entry describes what the case officer calls terminal residual management. Historians who have reviewed this language believe it means what you think it means. This is where the story stops being a bureaucratic curiosity and becomes something much darker. Here is what researchers have been able to confirm, sourced from declassified FOIA documents, the partial journal archive, and cross-referenced census discrepancies. Between 1947 and 1961, at minimum 2,900 individuals were processed through some form of administrative identity erasure by U.S. federal agencies. Researchers who round to the common figure of 3,000 are accounting for cases where documentary evidence strongly implies additional subjects, but direct confirmation remains sealed. Of those confirmed cases, approximately 100 were foreign nationals, scientists, defectors, intelligence assets. Approximately 900 were American citizens who entered the program voluntarily, most under significant duress, and approximately 700 were American citizens for whom no consent documentation has ever been located. 700 people, erased, with no paper trail of agreement. The officials who ran the program, and their names are now partially known, faced no charges. The legal architecture of wartime emergency powers created a near-perfect shield. By the time congressional oversight committees began examining intelligence abuses in the mid-1970s, the famous Church Committee hearings, the specific administrative erasure operations had been so thoroughly compartmentalized that investigators only grazed the surface. The Church Committee found evidence of identity manipulation programs. It named adjacent operations, but the full scope of administrative erasure was never publicly entered into the record. And here is the thing that should stay with you long after this video ends. The emergency statutes that made this program legal in the 1940s and 50s, most of them are still on the books. Modified, yes. Constrained by subsequent legislation, yes. But the skeleton of that legal architecture is still standing. 3,000 people, erased not with violence, but with paperwork, with bureaucratic efficiency so complete that for decades, the main barrier to finding the truth wasn't secrecy. It was the sheer mundane normalcy of the mechanism. Nobody looks for monsters in filing cabinets, but they're there. The people who were erased are, in most cases, gone now, deceased, their new identities taken to graves that bear the wrong names. What remains are the gaps, the census anomalies, the families who spent lifetimes searching for someone who, according to every official record, simply never existed. That is what power looks like when it decides your existence is inconvenient. Not a bullet, a stamp, a redaction, a clean white wall where a life used to be. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. Next week, the small town that was secretly evacuated, rebuilt, and handed back to its residents, and why almost none of them were told what had really been buried underneath it.